This is the Decarbonization Disruptors podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Cohen. On this episode of our podcast, I am very pleased to welcome David Meyers, founder and CEO of Gridtractor. Gridtractor's mission is to help farmers take control of their energy use by leveraging renewable energy, electrification, and utility incentives with the overall goal of making sure the agricultural community does not get left behind in the global energy transition. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Matthew.
Yeah, it's a real privilege to have you. I'm excited to talk about what you're doing at Gridtractor and all the exciting things that are happening there. I wanted to first get into a little bit about you and kind of your transition into this career, because I understand it. You started your career in the marine industry and kind of worked your way into the energy management sector. And I just want to learn more about kind of how that came to be and what led you to this point.
Briefly, I was a naval officer in Israel, and from there continued to work in a variety of vessels offshore and near shore and so on, and got into the business side of shipping. I was doing consulting for really a wide array of global clients, from the Panama Canal to Exxon to shipping companies and all kinds of stuff, and got to the point that I was commuting every couple of weeks to Latin America, mostly Mexico, and helping them make their black energy production and transportation more efficient. And I kind of scratched my head, thought, well, there's a green energy revolution happening in my backyard in California, which would do some good for the world. And I'm, away from my kids, helping to get more black energy on the market. Maybe I could flip that around. And so I looked for a role in clean tech. At that point, was not really particular. I would have happily worked in solar or wind or anything else, and came across EnerNoc, where I was hired to lead the Western region sales and business development, doing demand response, energy efficiency management software, services, and so on. And that's what really got me into kind of the side of the business dealing with load management, how to reduce energy usage and how to time it better to benefit the grid and the end users. And most of that has been on the non-residential side. So really all commercial, industrial, agricultural, and institutional type customers.
You are one of the very many former EnerNoc alums that have gone on and do great things. I feel like EnerNoc sort of birthed quite a few entrepreneurs who have gone to start companies. I'm sure you still deal in that world a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that when the history of the industry is written, it may be that EnerNoc's contribution is not necessarily the technology or the business model, but really the people that it developed, often from new college grads into managers, and they're out there, leading companies, leading really all kinds of efforts in the energy transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of your background, because we on this podcast, we have lots of different people that come from different areas, whether it's marketing, energy, operational leadership. Yours is more skills leadership, as I read. And I was curious kind of your perspective, and I know it's a broader question, but given your experience, kind of what the commercial and or the utility customer is looking for when it comes to technology adoption. I mean, I know there's a lot of different factors, but when they're taking on a new technology, what's been that sizzle that you've seen that's been consistent that customers are looking for when they see a new software, a new technology, and they want to adopt it? What's that tipping point that makes them take that risk?
Right. So I'd say the first important thing in the premise of the question is to split out commercial and utility, because they work under very different incentive structures and organizational structures. So commercial is fairly straightforward. Of course, it somehow has to trickle down to dollars, and most salespeople know how to do an ROI calculation for their particular system. And that is, at the end of the day, what commercial customers need. But the other thing is it has to fit into their operations, whatever those are, and their broader technology strategy, and the people who they have to implement and use the technologies. And I think that's where the good product designers, marketers, and salespeople know how to succeed, is by fitting into those organizations, whatever they are. So if you have a point solution that is just sort of makes one little thing a little bit better, and maybe it gives a 20% ROI, but it's another login, it's another training, it's another contract amount, all of that. That's harder. On the other hand, if you can bring things together, if you can put some better or more information in the place that business users, business customers are already doing something. So in our world, for example, we are bringing information about energy prices and costs. And what we try to do is bring it at the point of decision making where, let's say, the fleet manager is deciding when to operate and charge vehicles, or when the farmer is irrigating fields. If you try to do it separate from the existing business process, you're adding a bunch of costs that don't get accounted for in your clean little ROI calculation. So there's a lot of understanding of the users, who they are as organizations and individually, so that that ROI truly helps, so that you're getting that benefit in a way that doesn't burden them with, hidden costs of time, effort, etc., contracting, all of that. So that's on the commercial side. But if you can solve some problem and you can do it within their broader strategy, then you can have success. They prefer to have, again, if you're adding up hundreds of logins for each little problem, you're probably not going to enjoy huge success. If you can bring it together through open standards, APIs, partnerships, collaborations, then you'll have more success. Full stop. Utilities, especially investor-owned utilities, have an entirely different incentive structure. They're looking to rate-based costs. They're not necessarily looking to save money. And so they're going to have an array of incentives around meeting their regulatory requirements, serving their customers, reliability that's not a pure ROI calculation. And there, I think it is the solutions that help them to get done what they need to, and think about it as, maybe taking something off of their plate and making as complete a solution as possible, so that they don't have to go and piece together things, and they will often outsource those things. The other big difference is in the commercial sector, you can make cold approaches, whether they're cold calls or emails or using your marketing automation, and you might make someone think, oh, that's an interesting idea, I'm going to check it out. With utilities, you really have to understand the processes that they're in and figure out how to get on the trains that are departing or have left the station, rather than trying to create a new route, because with utilities, that's extremely difficult. I will separate from that, and there are companies that are really good at this. There are co-ops, there are the community choice aggregators, where really when they save $1, that some of that either goes to other investments they can make, or it goes back to their customer base in the form of lower rates. And that's a sale that's more like a typical municipal or public sector sale than a utility. But the investor-owned utilities really are a separate beast. Do we have time for one more comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
On that?
Yeah, please.
I had been selling to commercial industrial customers, and when I went to take a job selling to utilities, I contacted one of those EnerNoc alumni who had gained experience in the same sector. And he said, well, how when you go to a customer meeting and they say they like that, and you prepare a proposal with pricing for them to sign in the commercial sector, he said, with the utilities, when they say I like that, that doesn't mean send a proposal. It means come back 6 more times over the next 2 years and maybe we'll do something. So very different pace and style of operations. And he was right. He was 1,000% right. And he gave me that advice.
Yeah, I know the complexity of that. And I think that experience, I'm sure, helped you in creating Gridtractor. So I want to learn more about kind of what went into founding Gridtractor. And you talked a little bit about it in the beginning, but kind of what motivated you to really steer your focus into agriculture that I imagine is an area that's been underserved.
It is, and there were 2 steps to that. So again, it ties back to a company that we acquired at EnerNoc to focus on agriculture. And people went where they went and ended up deciding that a focused company for agriculture could do better, and that was Polaris Energy Services. And I was hired to do initially some research there on essentially how to do better load management for the agricultural sector, how to engage them with things like better demand response programs, real-time pricing, and so on. And I went on to lead Polaris and to develop what has turned into California's dynamic pricing pilots, which worked really well for agriculture. It's a much better way, specifically for irrigation pumping, for them to be able to manage their irrigation in a way that was responsive to the grid and paid them a lot better than the kind of current mix of rates and tariffs and demand response programs. At the same time, we saw electrification coming and thought, well, what's happening in the agriculture sector? We saw that it was behind the other sectors, but that as it caught up, we'd run into a challenge of where you could charge tractors, and by the way, other vehicles, and we can get to that, but it's not just tractors, if they electrify. And where to charge and the utility infrastructure to do so is a problem across the board. So most of the delays in rolling out vehicle charging have to do with the utility infrastructure. And what we realized is that on farms in areas that use a lot of irrigation pumps that are driven by electricity, we have a tremendous amount of infrastructure. And from all of that work optimizing the irrigation pumping for energy cost, we knew exactly when they run, how much they run, where they have flexibility, and sort of the inverse of that, if you will, the yin and the yang is, well, what's left over could be used for charging. And we said, well, if we can take those electrical services, get done the irrigation pumping that needs to happen, and then add chargers there of the right size and capacity, and also model the needs for the electrical equipment usage, then we could provide charging services without new electrical services. That was really the idea. And so we founded Gridtractor and kind of ran it in parallel with Polaris for a while. Eventually decided that these should be two different companies. And so I spun Gridtractor off as an independent entity. And so the heart of it is to provide charging, just to get charging done in agricultural and rural environments, which has its own challenges because we're early, but especially our niche is charging along with other electrical equipment that has to be served and figuring out how to co-optimize two or more usages of power, where charging is one of them.
And I'd be curious to kind of see what your experience has been in the farming community, because as I imagine farmers deal with a lot of headwinds, very tight margins, seasonality, weather. I mean, things are just piling on with them in any given moment. So when your team is talking with the farming community, what has the biggest hurdle been to kind of getting them around to the idea of thinking about energy in a different way, and how have you solved that for them?
So the farming sector is under tremendous pressures, market-driven, both markets for their products and the labor market and labor shortages, as well as environmental, and that's both the requirements that customers want sustainably grown products and the actual environment, meaning our water supply and aquifers drying up and things like that. With that said, contrary to popular belief, these are not low-tech customers. There's a tremendous amount of technology that is used in farming. Some of it, blows away what you see in other sectors. So it's not that farmers are not open to technology or able to adopt it. The challenge is that, there are many challenges. One is that for the size of business that they are, often there are relatively few people who are involved. Unlike, we talked about a typical commercial sale, you don't have a chief information officer and a chief technology officer, right? You've got, a VP of farming, and maybe you have an irrigation director and someone that runs all of the equipment. And so you need to bring it to them in a much better packaged way than maybe you would others. In other words, if they have to do a lot of integration, if they have to do a lot of planning, if they have to do a lot of analysis, it's going to be really difficult. So you have to bring it a lot closer to them. And then they're often willing to try it. I would say the other thing, in other industries, we would talk about pilots. We do a pilot for some period of time, and then if it works, we adopt throughout an entire company. Farmers will often look at it in sort of a similar way, but often in terms of their acreage, like, okay, we'll try this technology on some number of acres or on some number of vehicles out of our fleet. But just by the nature of agriculture, you have an annual cycle where you're not always doing the same thing. So in banking, I could do a pilot for 3 months, and if it goes well, I roll into a production rollout. The bank is always doing banking, right? So if that pilot ran from September through November and then it's good, you can kick right in December. In farming, you can do a pilot on some portion of the fleet or land, and then when you finish that, you're in a season when they're not irrigating or they're not using tractors much. And so you roll around to another season. So you almost need to think about the timing almost 4x what a typical commercial sector would be, not because they're not willing to do it, not because there aren't opportunities or any of that, but simply any given thing that you do is only going to happen for a portion of the year. And so you've got to roll with that. Not to mention that there are times of year that they're extremely busy. So the windows in which they consider a new technology, try a new technology, and so on are very specific, and they're not year-round, because there are times when they must be planting, and that's all they're going to do. They must be harvesting. That's what they're going to do. And so commercially, it requires more patience, which patience is not just your human patience, but you have to have the organizational strength and the funding to be patient.
Right. So as long as they can see that it works in irrigation, planting, harvesting, it's got to work in like all four phases, all multiple phases of farming for them to see that it could work for their operation as a whole over year round.
Well, or it's a technology that's only used in one of those. Right. So if you have a technology for irrigation and their irrigation season is 4 months or 5 months, you have to have it ready before that season, try it in that season, and then you wouldn't get a larger rollout. You might start implementing, but in terms of them actually using it and getting feedback, it will be the next irrigation season. Excuse me.
Right. I'm wanted to understand more about kind of how you look at decarbonization within the farming community, because most of the time, just broadly, when we think of carbon emissions with agriculture, it's more of what they output, or as far as their emissions. In how much is being really paid attention to when it comes to their emissions that they're using, as far as their energy use, and what can be done, kind of bring more attention to that sector, so more technology can be implemented, more money, more funding. What do you think needs to be that tipping point where that industry really gets an influx of technology to lower their overall carbon footprint?
So first of all, it is happening. The primary driver is the market, is their customers asking for more sustainable product, asking farmers to track the carbon emissions so that they can measure them. If I'm going to get milk from here or milk from there, what were the emissions involved in producing that? So that, more than the government levers, seems to be what's moving the markets. So for example, even California, which has the most aggressive plans for electric vehicles, those requirements for now are for on-road vehicles. So tractors would not be included, even in the 5 to 10 year time frame in the most aggressive scenarios. So there need to be a little more carrots than sticks in that sense. And those carrots come from their buyers, and the carrots come from savings. So to the extent that these technologies are, and I think really need to provide them with value that is not just for the good of the planet, but is for their good. So an electric tractor, for example, saves anywhere between 50 and 75% on their operational costs of operating that tractor. And it also has some qualities that are just better. So much of a tractor's energy is used to drive equipment. And on a traditional diesel tractor, it's done with, it's called a power takeoff, something spinning that's going to give you the power that you need. That can be done a lot better with electricity, and certainly a lot more efficiently. So when you can provide those benefits, and then also their buyers say, oh, wow, this is a more sustainable product, that's where you have the greatest opportunity. I don't think that the emissions themselves are enough. They have to provide benefits. But remember, emissions are caused because you're using stuff that pollutes. That stuff costs money. So if you can reduce that, for the most part, you're also going to reduce their cost. Now, a new vehicle may have a higher price tag right now, and that's where the incentives can help. So where we have incentives in California to replace, let's say, a diesel vehicle or tractor with an electric version, you can kind of normalize their capital costs, and then they get the operational savings.
Yeah, it makes sense. And going off that, I wanted to get your take on kind of what technologies you see on the horizon, specifically for fleet electrification kind of in this space. I know that I read somewhere that you're working with a company that does more autonomous tractors. So is that the overall future? What technologies you see on the horizon within the kind of the fleet world of electrification that this sector or other sectors could adopt that could be helpful to you?
In our case, we're working with Monarch Tractor, which, to give a plug, is a phenomenal partner on all fronts. And you really have two value streams from their tractor. One is the autonomy, and the other is that it's electric. But those do operate somewhat independently. So there are autonomous tractors and vehicles that are internal combustion, and there's electric that's not autonomous. So certainly it's a good combination. Autonomy provides tremendous labor savings. It addresses safety issues when you're doing things like spraying chemicals. It gives you a lot of flexibility in operations that you don't otherwise have for when you operate at different times of day. So I think we'll see that continue to grow. On the fleet electrification, I feel it's a little bit like mom and dad saying, eat what's on your plate right now. And by that, I mean, we've had a tremendous outgrowth of technology in the last few years. And we need to digest it and really use everything that is there. So for example, we've been a leader in implementing a protocol, which is a standard across the fleet electrification industry that enables us to communicate with and manage chargers. I would love to say that standard works seamlessly across charging equipment and that you can go talk to any of them and do the same things. It's just not there. The information, I think if we look at electrification more broadly and charging, there's still a lot of disappointment out there in the experiences that drivers and operators of electric equipment and vehicles have. I'll give you one sort of personal example, which is not on the fleet side. You look in your app and you see that there are two places that you can go charge, and one has a 200 kilowatt fast charger and the other has 100 kilowatts. So you say, well, of course, I'll go to the 200 kilowatt. Turns out that at the moment that you go there, even though it's a 200 kilowatt charger, it's only providing 50. And the 100 kilowatt charger was providing 75. So you actually could have charged faster at the 100, but you have no way of knowing that until you actually plug in. That's not part of the information. That's not in the data flow that you receive. So we have a lot to do with that. On our side, a lot of what we do is on the grid side, the pricing of electricity and making sure that is creating the correct incentives. So there is a lot to digest to get that working right for fleets. I think the other thing, which is our particular focus, is that most of these chargers should and do go at places where there are other activities. So at businesses, at factories, and so on and so forth. And so getting the best use out of existing infrastructure by managing charging with other activities, I think is, and when I say activities, I mean other energy consumers, whether it's the HVAC of a building or production line of a factory or anything like that, that will get the most out of the infrastructure investments that we make. If we make them inefficiently, meaning every time you put in 200 kilowatts of charging, you need 200 kilowatts of new service, we're never going to get there and the costs will be excessive. And then the other is the innovation with the utilities and the grid, which is more difficult. Vehicle to grid, selling power back. I mean, we now have millions of batteries sitting there that can provide grid services. We are at the very, very, very earliest days of making that happen. And just, again, the technology exists, but making it work so that a user, a customer, with the help of a company like ours, could get involved with that without sort of a Herculean effort, and that everybody's going to get something out of it, right? So the service provider has to make some money. They have to get enough savings. The utility has to see the benefits. That is still extremely difficult. And so we need to digest what we have in a way that creates business models so that companies like ours can thrive, because the customers and users won't do this alone. And so we're not yet at a point that business model, that sort of pro forma across utility, service provider, and customer adds up.
No, it makes sense. And I think, that digestion as it happens that you're talking about, I think once it completes, I think we'll be in a better place. So, this has been fantastic. I think our audience will really appreciate it. In closing, anything, I want to give the time to share anything that's going on now with Gridtractor or upcoming that our audience should know and get excited about.
Sure. Well, what's most exciting for us is that we have a grant from the Energy Commission with which we can bring incentives to help customers in their agricultural or really any rural customer to electrify their equipment. And specific, the incentives that we bring are for the charging equipment and the software and the hardware. There are other incentives for the vehicles, the tractors, the equipment itself. But together we can make that adoption a lot easier. It also pays for a lot of this work that I mentioned that's difficult, the project development, figuring out where you're going to put the chargers, which size, which ones to buy, the app to control them. There are a bunch of incentives through this grant with which we can help customers, and we have a pretty as easy a process as possible to help them evaluate what they can do. I would just, one thing to keep in mind, we talk about farming. I've talked with 2 customers just in the last week, and you say, okay, well, they've got farming, so they've got irrigation pumps. They also have residences on their premises. They also have production facilities. They also have office space. They also have warehouses. So, we say ag, but it is kind of a microcosm. And so for them, and by the way, retail, right? We make olive oil, and people can come and try out the different olive oils I'd rather do wine tasting, in our tasting room. So, they've got chargers for people coming with their Chevy Bolts or, Teslas or whatever else. They've got all of these industrial things. So ag really is a way to try out all of these things because it encompasses everything under the umbrella, often of a single company. And so we're figuring that out for them, and would love to work with more rural customers to figure out electrification for them.
No, I mean, it's very exciting, and I'm excited to see what you do here going forward as the energy transition continues to evolve. So again, David Meyers, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. This is the Decarbonization Disruptors podcast, and we will see you next time.